I just wish he knew, how much he's still loved around the world.
At 86,
I just wish he knew how deeply he was still loved all around the world, because at 86 years old Jerry Schilling finally chose to speak about the night the world was told Elvis Presley was gone, and according to him what really happened inside Graceland was nothing like the story everyone believes. For nearly 50 years Jerry stayed silent, but now he says Elvis didn't simply vanish from life, he stepped away from it, and to understand that night, you have to go back to the very beginning, to a summer day in Memphis when everything was simple, when Elvis was just a quiet kid with a guitar he didn't even own, and Jerry was another neighborhood kid looking for something to do. They bonded fast over music, dreams, and late-night drives through empty streets talking about life and the future. Elvis used to joke that if he ever made it big he'd buy Jerry a Cadillac. Neither of them knew how real that dream would become, because almost overnight, Elvis's life changed. Small clubs turned into television appearances, screaming fans, and global fame, and Jerry was pulled into that world too, becoming part of Elvis's inner circle, not just as security but as someone Elvis trusted, someone who saw the man behind the image, because behind the lights and applause was someone deeply lonely, someone who couldn't go anywhere without being watched, who couldn't trust new faces, who felt trapped by the name everyone adored. Jerry saw the quiet moments, late nights at Graceland when the house was full, yet Elvis felt alone, moments where he stood in front of mirrors staring like he didn't recognize himself, moments where the weight of expectations pressed so hard it felt unbearable. As the years went on the pressure only grew, the touring never stopped, the demands never eased, and by the mid-70s Jerry could see his friends slowing down, exhausted, worn down, struggling to keep up with a schedule that never cared how he felt. Elvis talked often about wanting something simple, a quiet place, a normal life somewhere no one knew his name. He talked about disappearing, not to be gone but to finally be free, to stop being the symbol and just be a person. Jerry thought it was late night talk until one evening when Elvis asked a question that changed everything. What if he just walked away? What if Elvis Presley disappeared? And when Jerry laughed nervously, Elvis didn't smile, because to him it wasn't a fantasy anymore, it was a plan. The night everyone remembers as the end felt strange from the start. Elvis was restless, pacing the halls, calm yet focused, checking the time, listening for sounds. Ginger had gone to bed and Elvis seemed relieved, playing gospel records, talking about travel plans that felt more like a performance than reality. Then he stopped, looked at Jerry with a peaceful certainty and said, "If anything happens you'll know where to find me." And when he hugged Jerry it felt like a real goodbye. Not long after the house grew quiet, a doctor arrived earlier than expected, security was sent away on small errands, and then chaos erupted, voices shouting, confusion everywhere, yet things didn't add up. Help wasn't called right away, movements felt rehearsed, not frantic, and by morning the world was told Elvis was gone. Fans gathered, radios played his songs non-stop, and history was written, but Jerry stood there knowing something wasn't right. The face, the details, the timeline, none of it matched. And days later Jerry was called back to Graceland by Elvis's father Vernon, who looked shattered and exhausted, and in a quiet room he told Jerry the truth. It was the only way to save him. The story everyone believed had been carefully arranged weeks before. Pressures from every direction, fame, money, powerful people, and endless demands left no escape except one. Trusted insiders helped create a clean break, a new identity, a chance at peace. Jerry hadn't been told because Elvis knew Jerry would try to stop him, and that was the point. Protecting him was part of the plan. Vernon handed Jerry a letter written in Elvis's familiar looping handwriting, saying he hadn't lied, he just couldn't take Jerry down with him. And for the rest of his life Jerry carried that secret, attending the public farewell knowing it wasn't truly goodbye, noticing the subtle differences others missed, receiving a photo months later of a man on a beach with 3 words written on the back, "Still here, brother." And every year after Jerry played the same song, lit the same candle, and wondered if Elvis ever watched from afar. When Jerry finally shared his story decades later, the world erupted again, debates, disbelief, hope, but Jerry felt peace for the first time in his life. And weeks after the interview he received one final package. Inside was a recent photo of an older man facing the ocean and 4 words written in blue ink, "Still here, brother, TCB." And Jerry knew then that his friend had finally found what he always wanted, a quiet life, freedom and peace, far away from the spotlight. After that final photograph Jerry didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window watching the city lights fade and return as dawn approached, holding the image like proof that everything he had carried for half a century was real. The world outside continued to argue, to doubt, to dissect every word of his interview, but Jerry no longer cared, because truth for him was no longer something the world needed to agree on. It was something he had lived with quietly for decades, and once the secret was finally spoken out loud, memories long buried began rising to the surface, moments that never made sense until now, moments he had dismissed as coincidence but now felt like confirmation scattered across time, because after 1977 strange things kept happening, subtle things, things that only someone who truly knew Elvis would notice. Months after the farewell Jerry would occasionally receive handwritten postcards mailed from different parts of the country, always brief, never signed, always written in that same Familiar looping style. Sometimes it was just a single line about the weather, sometimes a joke only the two of them would understand, sometimes nothing more than a reminder to keep going, to keep living, to keep trusting that silence was still necessary. Jerry never replied because that was the rule: no trail, no connection, no risk, but those small fragments of contact became anchors, reminders that his friend was still out there, still breathing, still choosing peace over noise. As the years moved on, reports continued to surface: sightings, whispers, rumors. A man who looked familiar buying tools at a hardware shop, a quiet figure attending church services in small towns, a stranger who knew too much about old songs and spoke with a soft southern cadence. Most people laughed them off, but Jerry listened carefully because sometimes the details were too precise: the way the man stood, the way he held a cup, the way he avoided attention without seeming afraid. And Jerry began to understand something important. Elvis hadn't vanished completely, he had simply stepped sideways into the background of ordinary life, learning how to exist without being seen, and that was harder than any stage performance. The hardest part for Jerry was watching the people closest to Elvis grieve without being able to ease their pain. Priscilla carried herself with strength, but Jerry could see the unanswered questions behind her eyes. Lisa Marie grew up surrounded by a legacy that felt more like a shadow than a gift, and every time she asked Jerry what her father had really been like, he gave her only pieces: stories about kindness, humor, generosity, but never the full truth, because protecting that new life meant accepting being misunderstood, and that weight never fully lifted. Yet over time Jerry noticed something else: Elvis's influence didn't fade, it evolved. His music continued reaching new generations, his voice still found people when they needed comfort, and Jerry often imagined Elvis somewhere listening quietly, hearing his own songs come through a cafe speaker or a passing car radio, smiling not with pride but with gratitude, because he no longer had to carry the expectation attached to that voice. Years passed, technology changed the world, cameras became smaller, faster, more everywhere, and Jerry worried that the past might finally catch up with the present, but somehow it never did, because Elvis had learned how to blend, how to move through crowds without being remembered, how to become forgettable by design. And that skill protected him better than any disguise. Occasionally Jerry would receive a call from a private number, no voice on the other end, just a few seconds of breathing, then a click. It happened on important dates, birthdays, anniversaries, nights when Jerry felt especially heavy, and he always took it as reassurance, not loneliness but connection from a distance. One night decades later, Jerry found himself standing outside a small venue where a local band was playing old rock songs. The singer stumbled through one familiar melody, but something about it felt different, and for just a moment Jerry felt a presence beside him. He turned expecting no one and saw only empty space, yet he smiled because some things didn't need confirmation, they were felt, and that feeling followed him home, warm and steady like an old friend walking him through the dark. As the world entered the age of constant exposure, social media, non-stop commentary, instant judgment, the idea of disappearing became almost impossible. Yet Elvis had done it before any of that existed, and his foresight saved him because he chose anonymity before anonymity became rare. Jerry sometimes wondered what Elvis would think of the modern world, the endless noise, the constant performance demanded of everyone, not just artists, and he suspected Elvis would have chosen the same path again: peace over applause, quiet over chaos. The interview changed Jerry's life. Strangers recognized him, stopped him, thanked him, argued with him, accused him. Some called him brave, others called him delusional, but Jerry stayed calm because the truth was no longer something he needed defended. He had finally shared it, and that was enough. One evening, months after the documentary aired, Jerry returned home to find his porch light already on, though he knew he had turned it off. Inside, waiting on the table, was another envelope, no stamp, no address, just his name. Inside was a short note written carefully, slower than before, as if the hand behind it had aged. It said, "You did good, proud of you," and for the first time in years Jerry cried without restraint, not from sadness but from release, because carrying silence for decades had been heavier than carrying grief. The note didn't promise another meeting, didn't ask for anything, it simply acknowledged that the burden had been shared, and that was the greatest gift Elvis could give. In the years that followed, Jerry began to notice something else. The world softened just a little, debates faded into background noise, curiosity replaced anger, and people began to talk less about whether the story was true and more about what it meant: the idea that someone could choose peace over fame, that walking away didn't mean failure, that survival sometimes looked like disappearance. And that message resonated deeply, especially with younger generations drowning in expectation, pressure, and constant comparison. Jerry received letters from people who said the story gave them permission to change paths, to step back, to choose a quieter life, and Jerry realized then that Elvis's final act wasn't a trick or a lie, it was a lesson, and perhaps the most powerful one he could leave behind. Years later, sitting alone at his piano, Jerry played softly, not for an audience, not for memory, but for gratitude. He imagined Elvis somewhere listening, maybe smiling, maybe nodding, maybe just enjoying the sound without needing to own it. And when the last note faded, Jerry didn't rush to fill the silence, because silence no longer frightened him. It felt like freedom, and on his bedside table the photographs rested side by side, the old one from the beach and the newer one by the ocean, both facing away from the camera, both saying the same thing without words, that peace was found not in being seen but in being allowed to live quietly. And if this truly was the end of the story, Jerry accepted it not with sadness but with pride, because sometimes legends don't need endings. Sometimes they just need doors, and sometimes the bravest thing anyone can do is walk through one and never look back. Same way it once had. Instead it settled into him like a second heartbeat, steady, familiar, always present but no longer painful. He began to understand that some truths are not meant to shock the world but to steady the soul, and what Elvis had chosen was not disappearance but transformation, the ultimate act of control over a life that had been claimed by millions. Jerry often thought back to their earliest days in Memphis, when everything was possibility and nothing was promised, and it struck him how full the circle had become, because Elvis ended exactly where he started, as a man with a dream, not of fame this time but of peace. Jerry noticed that whenever anniversaries came around the noise would swell again, documentary specials, endless debates, but somewhere beneath all of it there was a quieter current. People weren't just asking what happened anymore, they were asking why, and that question mattered more because it shifted the story away from spectacle and toward humanity. Jerry began speaking privately to small groups, not interviews, not cameras, just conversations, where he talked about pressure, about identity, about how success can become a cage if you don't choose who you are beneath it. And he never mentioned Elvis by name in those moments, yet everyone understood who he meant. The lessons were universal, the warning was gentle but clear, that losing yourself doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like applause that never stops. One late afternoon Jerry received a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was calm, older, warm, and it didn't need to say a name. They spoke only a few minutes about ordinary things, the weather, a song Jerry had played recently, the quiet comfort of routine. And before the call ended the voice said something Jerry would carry with him forever: "You don't owe the world an ending." And then the line went silent. Jerry sat there smiling, because that sentence explained everything. It explained why the story never resolved neatly, why there would always be mystery, because closure is something audiences want but peace is something individuals choose, and Elvis had chosen his long ago. As Jerry aged he slowed down, just as his friend once had, but unlike Elvis he did so without pressure, without expectation. He took walks, listened to records, watched sunsets, and sometimes imagined another man somewhere doing the same thing under a different name, with no guards, no schedules, no noise. And that thought brought comfort, not sadness. Because the bond they shared had outgrown proximity, it no longer required presence, only understanding. And when Jerry eventually sat for one last recorded conversation, he wasn't revealing anything new, he simply said this: some people are meant to burn brightly for the world, others are meant to teach us when to step away, and both paths matter. And when that recording ended, Jerry felt complete, not because the mystery was solved but because it no longer needed to be, and somewhere far from cameras and crowds, a man who once carried the weight of a generation continued living quietly, proof that sometimes the greatest legacy is choosing to live on your own terms even when the whole world is watching.